Welcome back, everyone, to PCS 101 for today's class, which is Wednesday, January 4th. And last class, I introduced the syllabus and the course outline. So if you've got any questions about either one of those, please let me know. It indicated that what I'm going to try to do is to duplicate what would occur if we were in an in-class situation. So the content that I would normally share in class, I'll have on these class videos. And then the class discussion will be through our class discussion form, where I will be asking you questions after each video that don't require right or wrong answers. I'm just more interested in your reasoning. And you're not required to respond to your peers, but encouraged to, much like you would in a real life setting. But you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses as well. The last question I had asked you last class was for you to introduce yourself, so I suppose I should do the same as well. I've been at GCC since 1993, believe it or not, for English classes mostly, but then I branched out to personal communication skills and also communications classes. I'm originally from New York, attended college in upstate New York, University of Rochester, where I majored in English and I minored in psychology, and then went to graduate school in California, UCLA, where I did my graduate work in Shakespeare and his contemporaries. And once I began teaching in California, I realized that I wanted to return home, and that meant looking for jobs on the East Coast, and that ultimately is how I ended up at Greenfield Community College, and I've been here ever since. So that's a little bit of my bio, my background. And for today, I was hoping that we could talk about some of the textbook chapters, though I'm quite aware that the class just began yesterday. You may not have had a chance to get the textbook. Note that there is a copy on reserve in the GCC library, and that I will be covering the major points of the textbook in these videos. Also, in terms of today's class, I had an introductory video for us to watch in the event that you weren't able to get to the textbook readings, which you can always do after the fact. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the one element on the syllabus that I didn't have a chance to discuss, plagiarism, which I'm sure you've heard of in other classes, using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. Very comparable to theft, but rather than taking physical property, it's intellectual property. And the consequences can be just as severe. So if you were to get off easy, so to speak, you could fail the assignment. If you weren't going to get off easy, so to speak, you could actually be expelled with a notation on your transcript that you plagiarize. So it's pretty serious. And I always tell two stories to encourage my students not to plagiarize. And both of these occurred pre-internet. And I'm well aware that as many resources that exist on the internet to help you plagiarize, there are an equal number of sources that exist on the internet to help instructors determine whether or not someone is plagiarizing. One of my favorites is Turnitin, where I can do a database search for a piece of text and see if it appeared in another source. I know that now artificial intelligence is in its infancy, and that means that plagiarism software is also in its infancy for artificial intelligence, but we know how quickly technology moves, so I encourage you to avoid any kind of temptation with plagiarism. And the two stories that I wanted to share with you, the first actually occurred to me early on in my teaching career. It's actually in California. And I was reading a set of papers, and I realized that one of the papers sounded familiar. Not that surprising. Teachers are pretty well read, though I couldn't rely on any kind of electronic searches because the internet didn't exist at that point. And eventually, as I continued to read the paper, it didn't take me long to figure out where I'd seen this text before. It was actually text from our college textbook, which I had assigned for the course, as if I wouldn't notice, with a few mechanical errors, perhaps trying to encourage me not to believe that this was plagiarized because there were mechanical mistakes in it, or perhaps the person was just sloppy when they were plagiarizing. But my story is not nearly as interesting as a story that actually was reported on the news. Believe it or not, there are academic newspapers, and this appeared all over the academic newspapers. And it was around the same time period, pre-internet, where a middle-aged professor, this part is important, is reading a set of papers, and again realizes that something sounds familiar. And as he continues to wonder, where have I read this before? It occurred to him he hadn't read it, he had written it 30 plus years earlier when he was an undergraduate in his own college. I know the chances, 1 in a million probably, that it had something to do with a fraternity that was recycling papers from old fraternity members. But regardless, the reality of it is that this professor's own student actually had the misfortune of handing in the professor's own work. And again, it's very unlikely such a thing like that could occur, but it did occur. And I think I feel even a little bit sorry for this student. Not that I usually feel sorry for people who plagiarize. The reality of not just being caught plagiarizing, but being plastered all over the media because of how unusual the story was. So I give you these two stories to encourage you if you are ever tempted to plagiarize, which I kind of liken to cheating on your taxes. It's not difficult to do, and it might be tempting, but it does come with consequences if you are caught. And in terms of our particular class, think about the idea that you're not supposed to have exact language when you are presenting information with an audience, as we will continue to talk about. What you want to do is to be able to communicate ideas rather than try to communicate specific language in the way that you would do in your writing. I kind of liken it to preparing for an important conversation, perhaps asking for a raise at work, where obviously you've rehearsed some of the major points that you're going to address, but certainly you aren't going to pull out a piece of paper and read those points to your employer. What you're going to do is to, in a conversational way, raise those points with your employer. You already have an idea of the elements that you want to discuss, but of course that could change in the moment depending on the employer's responses. So that said, for our first speech, the autobiographical speech, you'll be talking about something that you know very well yourself. This is very deliberate. So in some ways, the first speech is the most difficult speech because it is the first speech and you haven't had an opportunity to practice. But in other ways, it's the easiest of the speeches because the content is something that you are quite familiar with, which is your own life biography. That said, as we move on to informative speeches and persuasive speeches, you'll be adding on additional elements that you probably don't know as well as your own life history. But this first speech is going to be due on Tuesday, the 10th. And this gives us a little bit of time to talk about some of the major elements in the textbook, also to have a quiz, and also for us to have a practice session. As I had indicated, I'm asking that each of you touch base with me before each of the 3 graded speeches. To talk a little bit about how things are going in terms of your planning and presentation. It could be as informal as an email, just letting me know what your topic is, or it could be as developed as a Zoom call in which you actually present your speech and ask for my feedback, or something in between. So that said, you probably are not at the point, nor should you be, where you know what you are going to be discussing for your first speech. But I'm hopeful that after we've reviewed some of the textbook chapters that you'll have a little bit more clarity. And for this first speech, as I had indicated last class, you've got 5 minutes to present information. And that means that you're going to have to condense because obviously you have more than 5 minutes of life history. Whether you decide to give us the major elements of your life, whether you decide to talk about a particular time period or a particular topic. Individuals who tend to not feel very comfortable with self-disclosure, I usually recommend to them that they talk about education, whether it be their educational history or their educational present, how and why are you in this particular class now, or their educational future, which is about their goals, because education is the one thing that we all share. That said, one of the things that I'll be doing as the semester progresses is showing you some sample student speeches from students like yourselves, but in no way affiliated with GCC, presenting speeches, autobiographical speeches, so that you can get at least some models or some ideas about how to proceed. And then what we will be doing, because this is an online class rather than an in-person class, is that you will be recording your speech much like I record these class videos. And then you will be uploading them onto Moodle so that your classmates can view those speeches and give me feedback, which I will ultimately compile and make available to the class as a whole. Of course, if we were meeting in person, then this would be happening live within the moment. So as the semester progresses, I'll be putting a folder onto our Moodle site for speech number 1, as well as instructions on how to use YouTube, which is usually what IT recommends. That's the easiest way to go about probably recording yourselves and then uploading that onto our class. But the video that I was talking about that I thought served as a good introduction to the class as a whole is from Toastmasters. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of this organization. They are an international organization that helps members improve their public speaking skills. And they are in no way affiliated with academia. The idea is that these are just individuals who, outside of the context of an academic evaluative situation, just wanted to serve as each other's audience so that they could give each other feedback. That's usually the tricky piece of delivering a speech. You could certainly deliver a speech alone, but you're not going to get the feedback from an audience, whether it be feedback through a video presentation or whether it be feedback from a live presentation. So that's how these classes can be quite helpful, because you're not only working on your presentation skills, but you're also watching the speeches of others as well to help develop your skills. So this organization came out with a video, and you'll see that in the notes below. In the third section, I have the website for Toastmasters if you are curious to learn more about this international organization. But the video they came out with was about writing and delivering great speeches, which is approximately a half hour long or so. And you can see that in the fourth section in the notes below, I've got a YouTube link for that. So what I recommend that you do at this point, again, is about a half hour long or so, is that you stop watching this video and that you watch the Toastmasters video. Then you can come back to this video. I recommend that you come back to this at 12:55 for the timestamp. Hello, it's 12:55, so I hope you've had an opportunity to watch the Toastmasters video. And it basically reviewed some of the major elements that we'll be talking about over the course of the semester. And the different kinds of speeches that one could deliver: an informative speech, which should be clear and concise, a persuasive speech, where you want to try to motivate your audience that whatever it is you're trying to persuade them of is valid. And also, you probably want to apply or appeal to emotion as well as to intellect or reason, since we are made up of both intellect and emotion. There can also be speeches for entertainment, and those are usually speeches that have a good amount of storytelling or humor. While in our class we have an informative speech and a persuasive speech, we don't necessarily have an entertainment speech, but we do have the autobiographical speech. And I can say that, at least from my perspective, I find the autobiographical speech to be quite entertaining, to listen to information about the students in the class. And I think that you'll also find it to be quite informative, to learn a little bit more about your classmates. And when I say informative, I say that deliberately because I think these divisions tend to be somewhat artificial. I think all speeches have an informational element within them, even the autobiographical speech. And I think that all speeches have an entertainment element within them, or at least should try to attempt to have stories or humor or conversationality. And I think that all speeches have a persuasive element within them, even your autobiographical speech, that the pieces of information that you decide to share with us, the idea is that they have some sort of relevance to your life. That's what you're trying to persuade us of, or else you wouldn't be discussing these elements. The video talks about the importance of practice, 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 and I cannot emphasize enough practice. Oh, and did I mention practice? The more you practice, the more comfortable you're going to be. If you've never had an opportunity speaking in front of a camera before, it definitely is a different experience. So I encourage you to practice that, as well as also just practicing delivering the content for your upcoming speeches. Now, the preparation is of particular importance, and you should spend some time thinking about who your audience is. And as I had indicated last class, you've already got a sense of your audience because your audience will be made up of me and your classmates. So already, if nothing else, you know that you're presenting to a group of adults, and that means that there are certain language and certain topics that you could use that would not be appropriate, perhaps, for a more general audience where you might have children present, for instance. What your objective is. And I'm sure you're probably thinking, well, my objective is to earn a good grade to satisfy the requirements of this class so that I can continue forth with my educational goals. However, the other objective is that you can put together the elements that we've been talking about in terms of public speaking. So I see the first speech as a kind of practice speech, sort of putting together all of these suggestions, as well as the objective of your being able to share information with your classmates so that they know a little bit more about you, which is something that you did very briefly with the discussion forum question, but now you've got 5 minutes to do that with an autobiographical speech. Research, if necessary, and chances are that you don't need to do research for your first speech because you already know the content. That said, if you want to interview family members or look up some Ellis Island records, you could certainly do that, but it's not required nor necessary. The logistics of the speech. And again, if you were presenting live, you would want to know what the location would be, and you would want to know what the room setup is. You want to know your time frame, things of that nature. And for you, you know that definitely you are going to be recording. So you want to think a little bit about lighting and background. You don't want a background that's too busy so that it ultimately takes attention away from you. You want to make sure that we can see you. And again, we're not expecting that we would have a professional video with professional equipment, but we should be able to hear you. We should be able to see you, and the background should be appropriate. And writing the speech. And there are lots of different ways you can go about writing the speech. In fact, I've had many students say that they feel a bit uncomfortable with delivering speeches. They feel more comfortable writing. And if that's the case, what I suggest to them is that they write out their speech and then they reduce it to key words and phrases. And then they basically tell us what the speech was about, the key words and phrases being the outline of the speech. And I've had the opposite occur, where I've had students in English classes say that they don't feel very comfortable writing, but they do feel more comfortable speaking. What I recommend they do is that they record themselves speaking their speech, and then ultimately they can transcribe that. And what they've got is an outline, basically, of their paper. So you can work in a lot of different ways here. But you do want to have 3 elements. You want to make sure that you have an introduction to your speech. This is where you greet your audience and also where you usually give your thesis, which is your main point. The second part is the discussion section. In English classes, it's sometimes called the body. This is where you give your evidence, and this is where you give your details. And then the third section is the conclusion. And this is where you give a sense of closure and you say farewell to your audience. And then outside of the actual construction of the speech itself, you want to think about the presentation. Again, you want to be conversational. So you don't want to be reading your notes. You want to try to have a conversation with your audience or with the camera, which is basically the substitute for your audience. One of the ways to do that is to have a speaking outline. Speaking outlines will be required for all 3 speeches. And in fact, we'll be talking about how to construct speaking outlines over the course of the semester. But if you were curious, the outline that I include at the bottom of all of the videos, that's my speaking outline, basically. So I'm literally speaking. I don't know if you can see it or not. It'll be backwards, I suppose. I'm literally have the hard copy in front of me so that I can look down every so often and make sure that I'm headed in the right direction. And it's always good to have a hard copy, even if you have multiple computers, one for recording and the other for your notes, because if there's technical failure with your notes, then ultimately you've got challenges that you wouldn't have if you had a hard copy in front of you. And eye contact. So even though you've got a hard copy in front of you of your outline, you want to make sure that you're looking at your audience or you're looking into the eye of the camera as much as possible. Your body language, and again, you need to make some decisions whether or not you want to do a full body shot or a half a body shot. As you can see, I'm doing a half a body shot, but you do want to make sure that we can see your face, because this is where we're going to be reading a lot of your cues. Your vocal inflections, which we'll be talking about, that you want to basically vary so that you aren't sounding like a monotone, that you're using pauses. This is one of my greatest challenges, being a New Yorker, in that I don't pause enough. I'm quite aware of that. But a pause can be very helpful, not just for you to gather your thoughts, but also for your audience so they can reflect on what you're saying. And to try to anticipate audience questions and address them in your speech. Again, you may not necessarily be always able to do that, but especially when it comes to the informative and the persuasive speech, that can be very, very helpful. So the one thing about the Toastmasters video that I did not discuss, if you haven't noticed, was about nerves. And it's a reality that when people are speaking publicly that they feel anxiety, probably because it's something that they don't do terribly frequently. Unless you're an entertainer or a performer or a teacher, you probably don't speak in front of large groups. And again, speaking in front of a camera is probably not something that we do very frequently either. So it requires some practice. That's part of the point of this class. I think of it as a kind of workshop where you can practice and develop these skills. And as you know, there is an attendance question for each of the videos, and that's going to be the attendance question today on our discussion forum question about nerves and nervousness, and how do you go about controlling nerves and nervousness. And the textbook gives some suggestions, the Toastmasters video gives some suggestions, but I suspect you probably have your own ideas as well because you've probably confronted nervousness in the past. So this question will be at the ending of the notes below. So you can just click on the term discussion forum and that'll take you directly to the discussion forum question. Though you can also go to the discussion forum itself at the top of our Moodle page if you wanted to. And I'm asking you just to talk a little bit about some ideas for controlling, not necessarily eliminating nerves. Having some level of nervousness is good because it shows that you've got some investment in the activity. So you care enough to put some effort into it. But you certainly don't want your nerves to get in the way of actually being able to perform. So in terms of the textbook, what I had assigned with great hope were 3 chapters. Chapter 1, Speech in Higher Ed. Chapter 2, Getting Started. Chapter 3, Critical Listening. And if you're using a different edition of the text, the numbering might be different, but the content about speech in higher education, getting started, and critical listening was how I was hoping to begin today. And again, I realize that you may not have had a chance to read these chapters, even though I'm going to be discussing them now. So certainly you can go back to them after the fact. In terms of chapter 1, or speech in higher ed, they talk a little bit about the reasons why public speaking is important. And they use some language or some terminology that's associated with the discipline, which is what you oftentimes find in one-on-one classes, like this class. You're being introduced to vocabulary that's associated with a particular academic discipline. So these are the sorts of terms that could appear on a quiz, by the way, if you're wondering, because I wanted you to become familiar with some of the language. And as I had indicated, our quizzes will be open book, open notes, so that you can refer back to your notes and to your textbook as well. But They talk a little bit about the intellectual imperative for studying public speaking, which is just a very fancy way of saying that as a well educated person, you want to have breadth in your education. So you want to know a little bit about the major disciplines, and that includes things like rhetoric and public speaking. And if you know anything about literature, you know that literature began in the great oral tradition. Some of the great epic poets, like the Iliad by Homer or the Odyssey, began as epic poems that luckily were written down so that we could have access to them now. So that's one of the reasons why public speaking is oftentimes a requirement in a college education. But there also is the social imperative. The reality is that we interact with one another. So the idea of being able to communicate with one another. And again, for better or for worse, our world changed in 2020. And we've become increasingly reliant on using things like Zoom and video apps and just video recordings to communicate with one another. So that has become increasingly important. And I think that's something that's also reflected in our taking this class as an online class. And then something I've become even more interested in as the years have gone on, the consumer imperative. That as audience members, we consume the speeches of others, sometimes live, sometimes pre-recorded, sometimes on Zoom, sometimes a combination. And in some ways, I've always said that this is a difficult class to teach because while we talk about the techniques one should or should not follow, when you leave the context of the classroom, you'll see a lot of presentations in public venues that don't necessarily follow those techniques, that are not clear, that are not concise, that are not well researched, that are not ethical. All of the things that we want to do. And these individuals are oftentimes rewarded with money and with fame and with power. And of course, we know life isn't fair. But I always suggest that as consumers, we should demand more. If these are the expectations that we are held to when we are presenting to an audience, that we want to be clear and we want to be concise and we want to be ethical, then other speakers should do the same. And if they're not, then they should be held accountable. Now, public speaking tends to be circular. And the idea is that you have a speaker who gives a message, yes, but it doesn't end there because the message goes to the audience and then the audience responds. It could be something that's very overt, for instance, raising a hand, or it could be something that's much more subtle, like a body movement. But regardless, you're trying to read your audience, and then as a speaker, as a good speaker, you're trying to adjust accordingly. Now, this I can say is one of the challenges with delivering online because you don't have the audience response. I can say it's one of the challenges teaching online because right now, basically, I'm teaching to a camera rather than teaching to a group of students. So it's a very different kind of scenario. So you need to try to imagine what it would be like. And in fact, I've even had some students say that they prefer to have an audience. So as they are recording themselves, they might ask friends and family to sit in the area so that ultimately they are recording to a group of people, even though they're looking into the camera, if that makes you feel a little bit better. There's a story about the early days of the pandemic about a professor who needed to record in an empty lecture hall. And what he ended up doing was bringing some stuffed animals and putting them in the seats of the lecture hall so that when he was being recorded to this empty lecture hall, he could at least direct his presentation to the stuffed animals. So again, this is all off camera. You wouldn't see that, but it certainly helped him in terms of his presentation. So you can be somewhat creative in terms of this. I've always said that public speaking is smoke and mirrors in many respects. And there's a good element of acting that's involved in it. So, ethos, which means ethics or credibility, and it's something that we want to strive for. And as I had indicated, oftentimes we will see the speeches of others in public venues, political speeches, for instance, that don't necessarily follow this. And I think we should hold these individuals accountable. Now, your first speech has immediate ethos, ethics, or credibility because the speech is about your life. So we assume that you have expertise in your life and that you aren't trying to deliberately mislead us. When we start to get to informative and persuasive speeches, you might need to establish that you have some ethics, ethos, or credibility. In that you have, let's say, background knowledge in the information that you're sharing, or you've done research with the information that you're sharing. But again, the first speech is very deliberately the autobiographical speech because it's content that you know very well, so that you can focus on things like eye contact. And also, you have instant ethos or ethics or credibility. So, those are the major elements I wanted to talk about in the first chapter. The second chapter is entitled Getting Started, which is exactly what you are doing. You are getting started. You're selecting and narrowing the topic. And you know that basically your topic is going to be autobiographical. That said, what specifically you're going to discuss is something that you should be thinking about now. Determining the purpose. And as I had indicated, there can be multiple purposes involved in delivering a speech. Analyzing the audience and the occasion. And I always tell a story at this point because sometimes stories are a better way to illustrate a point than textbook information. This story actually happened to a colleague of mine at a sister institution. I'm not going to state which, but my colleague was teaching a public speaking class, and one of her students was giving a speech about being true to oneself. So it was a very philosophical speech. And through the speech, as it progressed, the student began removing articles of clothing. At first, it was shoes and socks and belts and jacket, and then eventually, as it looked like he was going to truly disrobe, the teacher stopped the presentation, asked the student what the student was doing, and his response was that he wanted to show the audience his true self because the speech was about being true to oneself. And obviously, she did not allow him to continue. And may I suggest that this student did not consider audience nor occasion, because he would have disrobed probably if he had been allowed to do so. And that would not have been appropriate for his audience nor for the occasion. Gathering material. And for your second speech, the informative speech, you might want to do some outside research and gather material. Or you might want to talk about something that you already have some knowledge of. But for your third speech, your persuasive speech, you are going to be asked to use at least 3 outside resources. So in this instance, you'll be required to gather material. But we're not at that point in the semester yet. Making a speaking outline, which I had indicated that we will be talking about in further depth as the semester progresses. Practicing out loud. And again, we've got some time before our first speech in our practice session, but certainly contact me at any point with your first or even your second or your third speech. As we all know, the intersession is highly condensed. And then finally, delivering the speech itself. So those were the major elements that I wanted to talk about in Chapter 2. They present this as a staircase, and I like that visual because we're at the bottom of the staircase at this point, thinking about what our topic is going to be and working our way up to finally actually delivering the speech. The third chapter is about listening, and I can very briefly summarize by telling you that we are very poor listeners. And there is a difference between hearing, which is processing sounds, which most people can do, not necessarily all. If you're deaf, then you aren't able to process sound. But hearing is very different than listening, which is paying attention and putting effort into thinking about what is being said. And there are many barriers that exist to paying attention. You might be aware of something called daydreaming, which is also known as, here's another technical term, the internal perceptual field. Basically, we think much more quickly than people can speak. So our minds begin to drift, and I'm sure we've all been in this situation where one idea leads to the other that leads to another, and before you know it, you've lost a certain piece of the thing that was being related to you. There's also the external perceptual field, things like the environment, things like temperature or noise or lighting. Again, when you are delivering a speech online, temperature probably isn't going to be an issue, but external noise or lighting could be an issue. And The speech rating handout that I included in the syllabus and document section, which I'll be talking about in the next couple of classes, offers some questions for when you should think about listening to speeches. And this also works for you when you are thinking about constructing speeches. And this handout will be the template that I'll be using when I evaluate your first speech. Questions I'll be asking myself when I'm reviewing your speech. So over the next couple classes, as I indicated, once we've had a chance to talk a little bit more about delivering speeches, we can talk about the specifics of that. But our next class, which will be tomorrow, will be about organizing and outlining in the edition of the textbook that I ordered, that's chapter 7. Also, beginning and ending speeches, that's chapter 8. And chapter 9, wording speeches. So again, our attendance question for our class discussion forum, that'll be due on Thursday the 5th at 9 a.m. If you need additional time, please ask me for an extension. What suggestion or suggestions do you have to control nervousness? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.